to the defense to counter every dollar that the offense spent. And therefore, the economics just strongly favored the offense.
McNamara convinced President Johnson to abandon ABMs, but only if the Soviets agreed to do the same. In 1967, war in the Middle East raised international tension to boiling point. America supported Israel. The Soviet Union supported Egypt, Syria, and Jordan.
The Israelis have released these dramatic aerial pictures to support their claim to have shot down 6 MiG fighters of the Syrian Air Force.
Israel swiftly inflicted a crushing defeat. America, fearful that the Soviet Union might come to Egypt's aid, prepared the Sixth Fleet for action.
The Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt. And as a part of that, the hotline was used for the first time. And one of the messages from Kosygin to President Johnson was, if you want war, you'll get war. And these were very, very tense times.
To reduce the tension, President Johnson and Soviet Premier Kosygin agreed to meet at Glassboro, New Jersey. In spite of the Middle East crisis, ABMs were high on their agenda.
The
president and the premier had a meeting, and the president started speaking. He said, let's come to an agreement. Let's each not build such expensive ABM systems. Kosygin said, I'm against this. Why do you object to a system that protects people? Defense is something moral, and aggression is immoral. Missiles mean aggression. If you agreed to reduce the number of aggressive missiles, then I could speak about reducing our defense system.
Whilst the arguments over ABMs continued, American scientists were preparing a countermeasure: multiple, independently targeted re-entry vehicles, MIRVs for short. One single missile could now carry 10 separate warheads, each capable of destroying a city.
Once you got into the MIRV era, the problem of strategic defense became infinitely more complicated, infinitely more expensive, because you had to devise ways of going after a multiplicity of warheads and all kinds of junk that would be put into the atmosphere to mislead the defense.
Одной противоракетой можно поразить по существу одну баллистическую...
One anti-ballistic missile is enough to shoot down one ballistic missile.
Баллистическая ракета имеет...
But now imagine that a ballistic missile has 10 separate warheads.
Тогда, значит, возникает необходимость...
In order to shoot down one of those missiles, you would need at least 10 anti-ballistic missiles.
Против нее по меньшей мере 10 противоракет.
Here are two figures for you to compare. The United States of America had on their land-based launching sites alone 1,054 ballistic missiles. To counter that, we would have needed over 10,000 anti-ballistic missiles. That would be madness.
Это безумие.
Советский Союз исходил из того, что если мы не остановим эту гонку.
The Soviet Union realized that unless we stopped the arms race, then the Americans, who were financially better off, could outdo the Soviet Union.
Строительство вооружений. И надо сказать, что к этому времени уже сказывалось вот это.
The leadership began to understand that now we had to choose between building socialism and communism or making missiles.
Или, значит, делать ракеты.
By 1969, the superpowers were, between them, spending more than $50 million a day on nuclear armaments. It was a burden both sides were finding intolerable. At last, they agreed to meet in Helsinki to try to halt the arms race. The negotiations came to be known as SALT.
Well, SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. It was an effort, in the light of later events, a rather modest effort to try and put some kind of a cap on the accumulation of strategic delivery systems.
The bargaining was not going to be easy.
Как в омут, вот закрывали глаза и ныряли.
It was like diving into a swamp with your eyes closed. There were a lot of doubts and difficulties in organizing these things, particularly because before going to the talks, the members of the delegation were called up by Brezhnev and very seriously warned not to say too much. He reminded them that the KGB was listening and the Lubyanka prison was watching.
The Soviets were far more hesitant about doing anything that might involve some sort of intrusion into their society, because inevitably anything to do with real arms control would involve inspection, verification, and so on and so forth. And this, for the Soviets, remained anathema.
Negotiations dragged on throughout 1970 and 1971, as each side tried to come to terms with the other's philosophy.
The Soviets really had it in their gut, in the marrow of their bone, this inherent right of a nation to defend itself. And there wasn't really any argument in those days, early days, of a technical nature, of a strategic, analytical nature. It was just the God-given, they wouldn't have said God, right of a nation to defend itself.
Советский Союз был как бы голый, окруженный вокруг.
The Soviet Union felt naked, unprotected, surrounded everywhere by American nuclear forces. It was very difficult to protect the Soviet Union. When we had developed our own ballistic missiles, although we had very few, we realized that it had acted as a counterbalance. But when we started the talks, we remembered all the kinds of weapons that could reach us.
Behind the scenes, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, arranged private meetings with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin.
These meetings made it possible to introduce corrections or amendments without losing face. Using the back channel with Kissinger, we could first state the official point of view and then talk more freely. I would say, Henry, mind you, or you should realize. I was really just thinking aloud. Then he would say, well, Anatoly, why should we get stuck on this? Why don't we do it in a different way?
Face to face across the table, the two sides made progress on ABMs, but they barely touched on the most destabilizing of the new technologies: multiple warheads, MIRVs.
The subject was not really discussed, because by then the Americans already had this technology, and Russia didn't. We believed that we should have it too.
Finally, in May 1972, after almost 3 years of negotiations, President Nixon arrived in Moscow to sign the SALT agreements with Premier Brezhnev. ABMs had now been discredited, and the two sides agreed to limit them. But all they could agree on offensive weapons was a temporary freeze on missile launchers. The superpowers were learning to cooperate. Yet their failure to control MIRVs meant that in the next decade, Russia and America would add 12,000 nuclear warheads to their arsenals. Preparations for global annihilation continued.